All right. I think we are live now. So welcome everybody to this conversation. I'm honored to moderate the conversation on working the body, hair raising and cosmopolitan whiteness. Transnational ideas of beauty from the perspectives of Dominican hair practices and Indonesian skin whitening practices. So welcome. My name is Lucy Mule, and I am a professor at Smith College in the Department of Education and Child Study. I am currently on the Duke Smith Meridians editorial advisory board, which is why I'm moderating this conversation. I'm here with Professors Ginetta Candelario and Professor Saraswati. I love that name, both accomplished scholars in their fields. Professor Saraswati is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Women's Studies at the University of Hawaii. She has won many awards as a teacher and author, and her courses focus on gender, sexuality, race, and media studies from a transnational perspective. Ginetta Candelario is a professor of sociology, Latin American and Latino studies, and the study of women and gender at Smith College. And as you know, since 2017, she's been the editor of Meridians. Her research interests include Dominican history and society, with a focus on national identity formation, feminism, women's history, Blackness in the Americas, Latin Americans and Caribbean, and Latina feminisms, as well as Latino communities, particularly Cuban, Dominican, and Puerto Rican. She also researches U.S. beauty, culture, and museum studies. Wow. Mouthful. So regarding this conversation today, as you know, we will have 40 minutes, during which time the two professors will talk about their work, specifically the two pieces that we are talking about today. And then we will have 10 minutes of question and answers where the two scholars will address questions that you can post on the ask a question button on the screen. So the articles we are talking about today are Hair Raising, Dominican Beauty, Culture, and Identity Production, which was published in year 2000. That's published by Ginetta. And Professor Ayu's article 2010, published 2010, and it's titled Cosmopolitan Whiteness, the Effects of Skin Whitening Advertisements in Transnational Women's Magazines in Indonesia. So to guide the conversation, we'll pose a few questions that I have shared with the two professors ahead of time. But before I ask the first question, I wanted to let the two authors know how much I enjoyed reading their pieces. And even though the people written about in these pieces are Dominicans in New York and Indonesians, I felt that every argument made and each example given and shared in the article spoke to me as if those examples and arguments were referencing cultural aesthetics of hair and skin in my own experience as a Black transnational woman. I had to keep going back and say, oh, are they not talking about Africans here? Because it is so familiar. Candelario spent many months in hairdressing establishments, talking to her study subjects. And I studied advancements of skin whitening products over a period of time. So this is research that they have done over a period of time. And I'm sure those of you who are listening will find connections to your own cultural experiences and intellectual curiosities as you listen to this conversation between these two fabulous professors. So the first question I have for the two of you is really an invitation to tell us how the current article is situated in your broader scholarship.
I'll jump in, because I want to make sure I leave enough room for Ayu. So I'll just say thank you, first of all, Lucy, for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. And when you were saying that last bit about being able to relate to our work as a Black woman from Kenya, specifically from the Nairobi region, I think it reminded me that someone we share in common, Wambui Mwangi and I, who went to Smith together, used to say that Dominicans were, an unacknowledged tribe of Kikuyus and Kenyans, because of the connections that we often saw in our cultural practices and things that we did and so forth. So thank you. So I'll just say, as I was saying in the green room, and I think I mentioned it yesterday during our conversation with the founders panel, that and Lucy and I were just reminiscing about the fact that we both joined the faculty at Smith in the late 1990s. I arrived here in 98 as a Mendenhall Fellow, and then joined the tenure track faculty in 99. And this was the moment when Meridians was being conceived of, literally. And Meridians, the editorial collective, who were my colleagues, my new colleagues on the faculty here, they asked me to consider submitting a chapter from my dissertation that I was working on at the time, because I joined the faculty ABD. And I hesitated because I was still actually writing a dissertation, much less giving them a chapter from a dissertation that was already done and was going to become a book, right? They were so excited and so convincing about the claim at the time, but now the fact that Meridians would be a really good home for something from this dissertation, and specifically for this piece on Dominican hair culture practices as a central part of national identity formation and display, right? Particularly among Dominican women in diaspora. And I hesitated because, as I said, as a tenure track faculty member who, we're giving so much advice about what to do and what not to do, what will serve us and not serve us as we're trying to get that golden ring that is tenure. But I was ultimately convinced because one of the people asking me was my former professor at Smith, Nancy Sternbach. And, if Nancy asks, you say yes. So I went ahead and submitted this chapter, and it was accepted for volume 1, number 1. And I have reflected often, particularly in these last 4 years now in my role as editor, on what a wise decision that was, because Meridians really did offer the exactly right home for that chapter, because it offered the exactly right audience, the exactly right set of readers, the exactly right set of reviewers and interlocutors who could understand what I was writing about, why it mattered, why I was framing the questions I was asking the way I was framing them, and why the answers that my we say subjects, but the women I was working with, and I think about it more that way, I was working with these Dominican women to help share their stories and to convey their own thinking about what they were doing and what it meant. It was exactly the right place, was this Meridians community. And I've been now in my position as editor, affirmed time and again that the journal really brings together this now, I hope, established, small, but established and growing community of women of color, transnational, feminist, anti-racist, decolonial faculty, and knowledge producers, because it's not just academics, it's also poets and writers and visual artists, performance artists, etc., who are in the room and in this conversation with us. So I think that's really what I'll say, and I'll pass it over to Ayu because there'd be more to say later, but that the journal affirmed everything that came after, right? The book that grew out of there, the work that I'm doing now, my own private, if you could, my personal, I guess, research, which picks up on this question of Dominican feminism in its other forms historically, and I'll come back to that later. But also my work as editor of Meridians. I mean, it really was born of that first invitation. And I'm just so honored to be here now. Ayu, I happily hand it over for that 10 years later essay.
Yeah. So first of all, of course, I have to say thank you so much for allowing me to, be here today and share my work. But for including me in this 20th anniversary issue, it feels so special, but also surreal. And this goes back to the question earlier because this was my first ever published article, like ever, right? And so hearing Ginetta also talk about that, this was also your first article, kind of like makes me think like, oh my God, like the Meridians is definitely doing something like amazing here. And I think for me, it was that title, right? Feminism, Race, Transnationalism. So when I learned about the Meridians the first time ever, I was, I think, first year grad student at the time. And so when I saw that title, I was like, someday I really want to publish in this, journal, right? Because I felt seen. Feminism, race, transnationalism. I felt like that's what I want to do, and at the time, obviously, I didn't have anything to submit, right? First year, so I was like, I have nothing, but I wanted to. I already have it in my head. I want to publish in this journal, so it was kind of like really a dream come true in some ways to have my work included then and now to be included in the 20th anniversary. So that's why I said like this feels like so surreal. But so in terms of like where this article fits into my larger scholarship, it's sort of because this was the first article ever. And that article then became a chapter of my book, which is Seeing Beauty, Sensing Race in Transnational Indonesia. And in this article and in the book as well, it was really, I wanted to look at whiteness or race, right? From a different sort of theoretical perspective, which was, at the time, obviously, we've learned about race and gender as visually constructed, socially constructed, as biologically constructed, right? But at the time, not a lot of works, articles, or books that talk about race as affectively constructed, right? And so this was what I really want to get at by introducing this notion of cosmopolitan whiteness, right? Because it's not just about something that's visually constructed. It's not even like necessarily about the materiality of the body, even though it has material consequences, right? What whiteness means, but that there's this sort of like the affective, right? Like the affective construct of whiteness, right? And so what that means is that when we see a person of a particular race and gender, there is something in our body, right? That kind of like, there's this affective response in the body to that figure, right? And the advertisements become part of what I call the affective structure, right? That then introduce, like structures, how we react to certain people because of their race and gender and sexuality and so forth, right? And so that's what I kind of like want to introduce. And that's what kind of like been carried out throughout my larger scholarship. And even in my second book, about social media, again, I'm looking at social media and feminist activism, but from the perspective of affect. And in particular, I look at pain and how by looking at social media from the perspective of pain, we can understand social media practices differently. So this really, I've like taken it like everywhere with me, kind of, like affect and race and gender and, media. But in my current work, it's more about the new media. But again, thank you so much for having this space, because I think sort of like going back to, my sort of mentioning that, Ginetta's work and my work were, part of our first articles ever, was because I felt something there encourages us, right? Invite us to submit because I guess in your case, Ginetta, you were literally invited. But for me, I felt like it was just like sort of like I felt like, oh, maybe there is a space for me. And actually, I mentioned this to you earlier as well, that when I read your work, Ginetta, that actually made me think that, oh, maybe if they are interested in work about race, about hair and beauty, then maybe there is a space for me to talk about beauty from a skin whitening perspective. So thank you for your work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ayu, for getting us started on the themes and arguments that are made in the two articles. So both of you argue that contrary to the common belief that women of color dress their hair or lighten their skins because of a desire for Caucasian whiteness, and this isn't really what you found in your studies, and you make arguments to that effect. Could you speak a little bit more about why and how you make this argument, Ginetta? And then if Ayu wants to add some more, you can do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I want to pick up. Thank you, Lucy, for the question, because it allows me to pick up something that Ayu was saying. Because what I see as a shared concern, and I think analysis to some degree, that we land, from different locations, but we land in a similar place around thinking about, how we are trained to perceive the body, first of all, as racialized, right? Like, because the body is not inherently racialized. We are socialized into racializing the body. I mean, that happens through perception, right? Through learning to see and perceive what we see in particular ways. And that was a guiding question for me, because very often, in terms of Dominicans specifically, when they are viewed literally from the United States perspective, which is a perspective that comes from a one drop of blood perspective on who is Black, and who should identify as Black, who is identified as Black, and who should identify as Black, and what on the body, right, marks one as Black, beyond the hypodescent, right? Because sometimes, according to hypodescent, one is actually Black, but may not look Black. I mean, someone like me would be categorized as Black under that rule, particularly in places like Louisiana and so forth, because I certainly have more than 1/32. I have more than 1/16. I have even more than 1/8, right? I can show you my grandparents' pictures, and you'll see, oh yeah, absolutely, Black people in her ancestry. So there's that, right? There's the hypodescent, but the conundrum for folks in the United States, and especially I think often Black people in the United States, when engaging with Dominicans around race, is that from these perspectives, from these trained perceptions, Dominicans are Black. Why are they not? And this is the narrative, right? Especially at that time, 20 years ago. Why are they not calling themselves Black? Why don't they understand themselves as Black? What is wrong with these people? Why can't they see what is so obvious to the rest of us and what must be facing them in the mirror, right? So this was the context in which I was doing my dissertation work and grappling with these questions of Dominicans, first of all, relationship to Blackness, and then this question of perception. Okay, well, as a Dominican who was trained academically and educationally in the US, even though I'm part of the Dominican community, I too had internalized that kind of US-centric idea of like, why can't we/they see what's staring them in the mirror? What is wrong in our perception? What are we missing, right? And I came to understand, first of all, the question is a very US question. Right? It takes for granted and assumes as natural and logical and as dispositive the US frame for understanding racial identification and racial categorization, particularly and especially around questions of Blackness. Okay, so part of what I had to do was unlearn that and decide, no, okay, that is a frame. It is a historically important one. It is a politically powerful one. It has a particularly important, we could say in some ways, resonance, okay? But it's not the only one, okay? There are other stories and other frames and other histories and other cultures and ways of thinking about and understanding racial formation, racial categorization and identification, and racial identity, okay? Especially around these questions of Blackness in the Americas, okay, and in the Caribbean. So that was the first task. The second task related to that was learning to think about how whiteness gets both naturalized and disappeared in the conversation, right? And is understood likewise as looking and being one particular set of things. In other words, in the US, whiteness is about purity, right? You can only stay or be white if there's never been any mixture. And secondly, it looks a certain way. right? It is, you know, paler, blonder, bluer eyed, and so forth, right? There is a model for what whiteness is and looks like. And again, in the same kind of path of unlearning, was recognizing that that's not the only way that whiteness looks, operates, is perceived, right? Especially again in the Americas, but I think we could say globally if we think about Ayu's work. So to kind of come back around to the question, the issue was to really think with and from the location of the community that I wanted to bring to the fore, which is the Dominican community, and particularly Dominican women who, in fact, contested all of those frames in a variety of ways, right? And the title of the book that I subsequently wrote from that dissertation, in which this chapter was a part of, is Black Behind the Ears, Dominican Racial Identity from Museums to Beauty Shops, because in the Dominican Republic and in the diaspora, we have a folk saying, which is that we are all black behind the ears. Todos tenemos negro detrás de la oreja. And what that means is, like, it means a lot of things, but among the things that it means is that, you know, we're black behind the ears and up front too. Like there are many ways to recognize, acknowledge, and enact our blackness, including in terms of how we do hair culture, okay? But they may not align with the ways that people in the US acknowledge, honor, and enact blackness. And in fact, they often don't, okay? Even as Dominicans today, especially, I think in the last 10 years, and it's really visible today, both in the diaspora and in the Dominican Republic, are also engaging in, for example, natural hair care practices. So now what we see is, instead of the Dominican beauty shops of the kind that I write about, which are focused very often on relaxing the hair, right? We see natural hair care shops becoming ever more present in the Dominican hair culture scene, both in the Dominican Republic and in the diaspora. And very often natural hair care practices now happening in the conventional Dominican beauty shop, right? As a way of bringing the black out from behind the ear and more to the front, right? So I'll pass the baton over to Ayu, because I want to give you a chance to pick up and to articulate more fully for us what you mean by cosmopolitan whiteness, right? As not just Caucasian whiteness.
Absolutely. So this research was based on, so the larger research of the book also includes interviews with Indonesian women, right? And so during that interview, I asked them, you know, what kind of skin color you prefer and all that kind of stuff, their skin practices and whatnot. And so what is very interesting is that consistently they would say that they do want to have lighter skin. They want to have white skin, putih, right? But they literally say, I do not want to be white like Bule, which is Caucasian whiteness, right? And so that was super interesting. And they would say things, you know, why they would not prefer Bule or Caucasian whiteness, and why they would prefer Indonesian white. They would use Indonesian white or Japanese whiteness. Again, this is very interesting as well. And so I think because every time I talk to colleagues, friends, or strangers or whatnot, and they ask you, you know, what are you working on? And I say, you know, I'm like writing about skin whitening cream. And then they would say, oh, it's so bad that these women want to look like us. And, you know, we want to look like them, right? And it's like, okay, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, take a deep breath. And so I think the cosmopolitan whiteness, first and foremost, was a language, a concept to answer to that. Yes, they do want whiteness, but it's not Caucasian whiteness. And they actually say that. It's not just me reading the advertisements, which I will talk about right now too. But women actually, Indonesian women themselves said, no, I do not want to look like Caucasian whiteness, right? They did not say cosmopolitan whiteness. And that was me reading the advertisements. And so I think there is this violence in that very assumption that women want to look white because they want to look like Caucasian white, right? So now with cosmopolitan whiteness, and I think it's sort of like double meanings there, because cosmopolitan, because I look at the magazines, right? I mean, the skin advertisements that were published in Cosmopolitan, both in Indonesian version of Cosmo as well as the American version of Cosmo, but also that there is this sort of cosmopolitanness in that whiteness, right? And what I mean by that is that whiteness is not just racialized, right, or nationalized as such, but it is also transnationalized, right? And what I mean is that specifically in these advertisements that I study, it is very interesting because I look at like different historical periods in Indonesian sort of like history and newspapers, as well as women's magazines and advertisements. And in the previous era, when they were advertising products from Japan, they would actually use models from Japan. And when they advertise beauty lotion from Indonesia, they would use somebody who is identified or encoded and decoded as Indonesian. But what is interesting about this particular period or era, the post 1998 reform era in Indonesia, was that you would see a South Korean celebrity advertising a French brand, right? Or vice versa. So we have like Japanese women advertising like companies from not from Japan, and so there is this sort of like cosmopolitan sort of meaning to this whiteness, right? And so whiteness no longer is being monopolized by Caucasian whiteness, right? That there are these sort of like different race, ethnicity that claim whiteness, right? But that it's not just like, this Japanese whiteness. They don't market their products as such, but this sort of like this cosmopolitan whiteness. There is, again, the cosmopolitanism, right? This sort of like the homelessness, there's no root in that whiteness, right? Whiteness is not rooted in this country or that nation or that race, but it's sort of like being abstracted into this sort of like, cosmopolitan whiteness, right? And with that notion of cosmopolitan whiteness, what I also want to get at is, again, that affect, right? Affective sort of meanings of whiteness. That whiteness has now that affect of the affective meanings of cosmopolitanism, which in the article I talk about transnational mobility, right? Transnational mobility. That means when you have this sort of like whiteness, it allows you to move transnationally, like with ease or like easier, right? Than if you do not have that access to whiteness, right? So access to whiteness become access to cosmopolitanness, and access to cosmopolitanness then become access to whiteness.
So that's okay. I'm gonna, Lucy, I know you have a question. I'm gonna
Go ahead.
That's part of the argument that I was trying to make, both in my book and in the article, which is that these categories are really stand-ins for power, right? For power, geopolitical power, economic power, political power in the national context, in the sense that so in the Dominican Republic, there's the expression Dominican white, right? And there's an expression white even in Germany, which is by way of like, Aryan whiteness, right? And the idea is that the women I was interviewing in the beauty shop were basically saying the same thing. No, we don't, that's not what we want, right? That it's not that kind of whiteness, or in fact, even whiteness per se that we are pursuing. It is, in the case of Dominican women, this kind of what they called the third term, what I ultimately, landed on as Indo-Hispanicity, right? That was taking elements from the kind of the Spanish, Hispanic, we're Caribbean Hispanic thing, and the brownness implied by Indio and indigeneity. And I'll say two things about it, and I want, give Lucy a chance to ask her a question, which is that really what became clear is that whiteness is not about skin color, hair texture, and all those things, although obviously that's there. It's about power. It's about who has the ability and the social entitlement to everything: mobility, resources, status, honor, political power, self-determination, sovereignty. And all of that, of course, is a legacy of colonialism, right? And the chattel slave system. I mean, that's a fact. That's where it comes from, that white becomes encoded as automatically, inherently entitled to all of that, to hoard, manage, control, okay, all of the good things in life, okay, including dominion over one's own body, right? So in that sense, if we keep that in mind, then doing work that navigates the fact of white supremacy, that navigates it, right, and to maybe outside eyes looks like it is embracing right? Some of the tenets of white supremacy, it's rational. It makes sense, right? What we also have to pay attention to, and this is the thing that I hope I did justice to in my article and in my book, is that it is strategic. It's not actually what's being embraced. There's a kind of wink to it, which is where the term "the black behind the ears" comes in, which is that yes, we're aware of white supremacy. Yes, we are equally aware of the flip side of that, or the companion to that, which is negrophobia, fear of blackness, right? And the stigmatization of blackness, right? In the Dominican Republic and anywhere in the Americas and the world where enslavement is part and parcel of our history, and where anti-blackness is part of our contemporary, right? So the question then is, how do I live my blackness? How do I live my blackness while also navigating these realities, right? And that's where I think this question of hair culture and really beauty culture in general asks us to think in more nuanced ways, right? And not just automatically assume a kind of internalization of misogynoir or of white supremacy or caucasity, right? Caucasity, like, you know, sometimes that happens, sure. Sometimes there is internalization, but I think that just as often there's a kind of, yeah, but not really. Because the other thing that Dominicans say all the time is someday whites will hang. It's a common Dominican expression. Algún día ahorcan blancos. Right? So if you're really listening to what Dominicans are saying, you're going to hear more than just a white wish or internalized racism or a rejection or a denial of blackness, which is what is often attributed to Dominican women, especially because of their hair care practices. There's like an inability to understand what are Dominican women doing when they are straightening or relaxing their hair, right? There's a lot more going on than a simple desire to approximate white women's looks. In fact, I think that's the most superficial understanding of that, and it does not capture, in fact, the really savvy nature of what Dominican women are doing when they are working with on their hair together. So thanks. Sorry.
Clearly, that complexity, you know, came out in both your pieces. And before I ask my question, I want to ask Veronica's question, which is posted because I think it relates to what we are talking about. And this is to you, Professor Saraswati. In your essay, you say, and this is a quote, "Whiteness is a virtual quality, neither real nor unreal." Can you please elaborate more on it? Also, how do you think women can disenfranchise themselves from this social construct that white is better than black, and rather embrace that beauty does not rest in having lighter skin?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this question. And so in the article, there is a advertisement that was by Cyber White. So the label of the product is Cyber White. And so I expand on this because I found this very interesting notion, right? Whiteness that has a virtual quality. Again, this sort of like the affective notion of like what whiteness mean, right? There is the sort of the virtual quality, and the virtuality of whiteness is that, you know, when we see something that's virtual, is that it is neither real nor unreal. What do I mean by that? It's not, whiteness is not real, right? And that's what I'm trying to talk about in my book. It doesn't actually have, you know, like when you look at the even like white skin color, when you go to a store and pick up that paint that says white, and you put it next to your skin, like whose skin actually has that white skin color, right? And so it doesn't have that sort of like realness, like, so which race actually is like white, right? In other words, these are like obviously constructed, right? It's not real as such. But also I'm also saying that it's not unreal, because it has real consequences, right? There are like these material consequences, there are emotional consequences, financial, legality. I mean, like, you know, whiteness is real, right? And we live through these, I think, Ginetta, you mentioned about, like how, this sort of like blackness, right? I mean, this sort of like navigating the world, right? And so the same thing, like what whiteness, right? What whiteness mean, why there is this so much desirability around whiteness. And that's what I'm trying to get at by saying cosmopolitan whiteness, because these women do desire whiteness, but not Caucasian whiteness. And what they do desire about whiteness is that cosmopolitan affect to that, right? It's that access. It's that access to transnational mobility. It's that access to all of these things that whiteness has, which is those real consequences in life, right? And so that's what I mean by real. It's neither real or unreal, right? And so the other thing too about, like how do we embrace beauty that is not always grounded in whiteness? So I want to take us even further than that by saying, how do we challenge this standard of beauty to begin with, right? And so rather than saying you're also beautiful with that shape of body, you're also beautiful with that shade of skin color, you're also beautiful, we should say, look, this beauty, right? This idea of beauty itself is very oppressive, right? And so that's something that we should really question, right? And so what does that look like then, right? How can we imagine the otherwise? Like, what does that mean for women, for all genders, to be able to embrace their body, right? But not in that sort of like commodified version of like, I love my body, I use this, I love my body, I'm gonna go and get a massage, right? Like so this very commodified version of like this care or love or embracing the body. So I think I want us to go there, to really challenge the very root of that beauty standard itself, right? And of course, right, then and this is why I also love embracing the notion of affect in terms of beauty, right? Because this is I include this in the intro to women's studies textbook that I co-edit, and there's an exercise there. And the exercise was sort of like asking students to look in the mirror and sort of like, identify their feelings when they look at the body in the mirror, and to look at certain aspect or certain parts of their body and how they feel about it. Because then we need to question when we look at ourselves in the mirror and we feel like we're ugly, or like we feel sad that we're ugly, or that we don't look like this or that way, then we should really question, like, who teaches us to feel that way about our body, right? I mean, who tells us that we should feel bad about being this way or that way? And so to be able to speak to that is power in itself. So I'm thinking here that that's why power operates through affect, right? How we feel is really, about how structure tells us how to feel about, our body or about other people, right? So I think this is what's very important, is to really challenge, to not feel the way that the powerful tell us to feel is in itself a very, I think, what do you call it? Like a rebellious act in itself, if that makes sense.
Well, thank you so much. I just wrote down what you said here so that I can remember to repeat it to somebody else. So our next question is, what would you do differently? And you've started talking about this, if you are writing this piece today.
Oh, so I can go first then. I think one of the things that I would probably do differently, I do a little bit of this in the article itself, which is, okay, so I argue that it's not Caucasian whiteness, that it is cosmopolitan whiteness, but there is this sort of like still desire to be white. Even at the end of the article, I talk a little bit about the skin tanning ads, right? But even that when they want to look darker, it's not about being black, right? So I hint at that. But what I really, if I were to write it today, then I want to ground my work even more in the anti-blackness sort of theories, right? And I think I think it would really ground my article in that, because yes, it's cosmopolitan whiteness, but at the root of it is this really sort of like anti-blackness, right? Like, I don't want to look like that. And even in the skin tanning advertisement themselves, it's really about bronze. It's about tan. It's not about, let's, blacken your skin, right? It's not about that, right? And so that there is, even in the skin tanning ads, there's this sort of the anti-blackness, sentiment that underlies this advertisement. So I think that would be something that I would want to highlight.
I'm glad that you landed there, because I was thinking that I wanted to make clear, and that I know you landed on that in your piece, Ayu, that at the end of the day, there's also the forced recognition that cosmopolitan whiteness or Dominican whiteness is only available to certain people, right? That there is in fact a line, right, so to speak, beyond which, you know, the majority can't cross, particularly in the Dominican case, right? And so that is a fact of this. So while I think that we do justice to trying to get at these nuances and to really elucidate and illuminate how socially constructed whiteness is, and that is a political project of control and access, and that folks who are seemingly embracing it in one form or another are really, you know, trying to navigate that and to get access to, which is, you know, understandable at the human level. But that ultimately, as you and I both land, I think one of the last things I say in my essay is that around this question of beauty is that for someone to be beautiful, ugliness has to reside elsewhere, right? And where does that ugliness land? More often than not, it is Black women historically, right? And women of color, women who are darker and of color, right? And that is the fundamental problematic that we have, is that it is framed as a dichotomy and an antinomy, right? An oppositeness. And so how do we recuperate beauty? Is there a way to recuperate beauty as a possibility, given that it seems that as humans, if you think all the way back to, you know, Greek philosophy, right, and our earliest known philosophy, love and beauty are so intimately tied together, right? Our philosophizing and understanding about what inspires us, what drives us to feel fundamentally connected or drawn to, right? Theories of aesthetics, is that as humans, we seem to really appreciate, right, that which we call beautiful. So the question becomes, to your point in your exercise, Ayu, is again, how are we taught, how are we socialized to perceive what is and is not beautiful in ourselves and in the world around us, right? And so your question is, you know, really a radical one. Like, what is the politics that we would need to reframe our perception, right? To allow for a practice of beauty that you know, doesn't throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak, right? So, because one of the things that I came to understand in my research was that the compulsion to alter the human body is worldwide and universal, right? It's worldwide, universal, and across history. There is not a single cultural group across time and place that has not in some way used the body as a canvas, right? As a canvas, and that has not altered or used hair texture and hair dressing, literally hair transformation, or piercings or scarring or coloring or tattooing or shaping, right? The body to signal membership, to signal status, to signal place in the life course, right? As preparation for birth, as preparation for death. I mean, it is what humans do, right? So the question then becomes, like, is there a way to recuperate it from the legacies of colonialism and chattel enslavement, right? Is there a way to take it back? And that's what I hear you asking in those final questions, right? Is like, can we rescue, right? That's fundamental, it seems, human impulse to transform and to use our bodies, right, as canvases, from that modern history of colonialism and chattel enslavement. I don't know, I hope so, because we are doing it, right? We are doing it, and you know.
Exactly. So as we wait to see if there are questions coming in from folks who are listening to you, could you talk to us a little bit about your continuing connections with the Meridians? You've told us how you entered into Meridians way back when. For you, Ginetta, 20 years ago. For you, Ayu, is 10 years ago. What kind of relationships do you see yourself having with Meridians?
I'd like to hear from Ayu because I know I'm editor, so here I am. Ayu, what do you think?
Yeah, so Meridians, obviously, I look at my whenever I design my syllabus, I'll always look at Meridians to see are there any articles. For example, I teach gender and sexuality and pop culture. Is there any article about hip hop? And obviously there it was, right? And so I use it in my own sort of syllabus when I teach, but also when I teach grad students, I have this sort of like assignment, which is kind of like a semester long assignment. It's their final paper, which is to pretend that you are going to submit your article to a journal. Right. So throughout the semester, they will have to work on an article, right, that they don't have to submit to a journal, but then they have to identify what journal that is. And obviously Meridians is always listed as, think about submitting here. So I think it's very always, and obviously, like I said, I can't say it enough, it's the first article ever that, that ever published. So it always has that sort of like feelings for me to to really, I think it's just a special sort of like journal for me, and so therefore in my scholarship, my teaching, I always try to incorporate that, and I hope to submit again in the future.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased that you use Meridians in your classroom and that you continue to be part of our Meridians community. It's really lovely to have you.
Thank you for including me. I'm overexcited. I apologize.
Does any one of you have final thoughts? I don't see any questions in the ask a question section, but probably there's something you wanted to say. This is a moment to say it if you didn't have one.
Yeah, I think one of the questions that you kind of wrote before, Lucy, that you were sort of like asking about, like how is this article still relevant, or in today's sort of like, or how does it relate to any urgent issues today? And one of the things that I was thinking about is that the police brutality, right, and the killing of Black bodies. And I was like, oh my God, this is exactly what I'm talking about here in terms of what it means for race and gender to be understood as part of the affective structure, right? Again, remember the affect is the reflex in the body, right? And so what that means is that when the police officer, right, looks at this, the Black man's body, his response, remember, his affective response within that affective structure is of fear and of pulling his gun and killing the Black body, right? And so I feel that this is one of the ways in which my my article attempts to address this sort of like, like why do we have, right, that sort of like, affective response towards certain bodies, toward people of like certain race and gender and not others, right? And so in my article, I just talk about whiteness, like white women and with certain facial features, and how this is part of that affective structure, right? I mean, this is where we learn, but not just learn cognitively, right? But in the affect, right? In the body. Like, how does our body respond that way, right? And again, sometimes we feel our body betrays us in that, like it it brings up this sort of like reflex of feeling certain things towards certain people of like a certain race and gender. So I feel that this is, every time I hear, another killing of the Black body, that's what I think about. This is the affective structure, and we need to really challenge how race is constructed in that affective structure, because unless this happens, then this sort of response, which is pulling your gun, which is not the same response when you see white woman's body, right? Again, this is that needs to be challenged, and that's what I think your question about how this article relates to what is happening today is still relevant in today's society, I feel. Thank you again. Thank you so much for this panel. I'm really excited. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a good place to end, Lucy. I don't know if you want to introduce the next panel or just let
yes. The next panel is titled "Another Truth Be Told: Women of Color Have Many Histories." Paula Giddings, hey Paula, and Vivian May will be moderated by Adrian Lance Smith. So that's happening at 4:00.
No, Yes, 4 o'clock. Thank you.
4 o'clock. Yeah, I can't wait.
Yes.
Sounds like a natural sort of continuation of what we are talking about here. Yeah.
Thank you, Lucy.
Okay.
And thank you, our wizards behind the scene who are making this all happen.
And thank you, everyone, for attending our panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, the two of you. It's just been so exciting to listen to the two of you talk with each other, about these issues. Goodbye, everybody.